Hannah is the lead of our communications team at the Intermountain West Joint Venture. She and I met way back in journalist school, journalism school at the University of Montana. She's got a background in journalism, which I think has given her a really unique way to like take on these media events, which she's done over the years as our communications and marketing coordinator at IWJV. But Hannah's going to tell you guys a little bit more about why we do these and how they work.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so we started doing these journalist workshops because we actually saw this model being practiced, and I will totally like give credit where credit is due to the Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources. They are an independent organization that does this very much this style of event that I have emulated my model off of. They aren't affiliated with an agency or an organization, so that makes them quite different from the ones we do. But I will totally give the credit to them for the inspiration on how we've set up this system. And so we've started doing these journalist workshops. They take quite a bit of time to plan, and so we only do one every couple of years. But the purpose for these is that we, as a conservation organization that is very much embedded within federal land and wildlife management agencies that works closely with state and nonprofit and for-profit entities, it's hard for us to get our message out there. And we are a small group that is very much the nuts and the bolts of how conservation gets done. And so these workshops are a little bit of a way to try to reach outside of our organizational silos to reach a new audience that is achievable through journalists and through the people that they reach with their publications. And so this is something that we only kind of practice infrequently because we want to make sure we can do it really well and that we have a number of elements that all walk through that makes this type of event engaging and valuable for journalists. And so the pictures that I have in this one was from one that I held probably is what is that, 3 weeks ago now, first week in June. I took a group of journalists to Thermopolis, Wyoming, and we coordinated with the Bureau of Land Management, with the University of Wyoming, Farm Service Agency, ranchers, the Weed and Pest District, Department of Ag, Wyoming Game and Fish. I'm probably forgetting others, Natural Resources Conservation Service. Those were all my speakers that came and brought these journalists out onto the Red Canyon fire scar, and we looked at the impact of that fire and with the presence of invasive annual grasses, how that fire is recovering in certain areas and not recovering in other areas due to that presence of things like cheatgrass. We also saw Japanese brome and other types of weeds. But we were trying to talk to journalists in this very kind of rural part of the world about the challenge of addressing invasive annual grasses at the scale that they can have an impact, especially when sagebrush rangeland fire goes through. And we always talk about sagebrush rangeland fire as being very different from forest fire and the frequency and the needs and the intensities and all the management implications that come with it. So we kept kind of the topic very narrow to that. So that kind of gets to my 5 hot tips on how to do one of these events. So that first one is establishing your news hook. Like, why is it worth a journalist's attention now? So these journalists, kind of across the world are now having to operate in a 24-hour news cycle where things are happening and reporting is occurring all the time. There's no pause on Sunday. There's no like, let's just do feature stories in the Sunday Gazette. News is happening all the time. So you've got to have a hook to get a journalist's attention for why is it newsy and why is it important for them to be covering this event or this topic right now. Um, so that often is the foundation of where we start with one of these journalist workshops to, because a lot of the times my colleagues are like, that was great, let's do it again on X. And I was like, what's new? What's spicy? What's intriguing? Like, why now? So always thinking about that as like your first step if you're thinking about doing an event for media representatives. I got a call when the Storyteller Circle announced that this was the topic for today's talk. And it was a gal who works for the Bitterroot Water Partnership. So that's a small collaborative in Montana. And there's a big mine proposed to go in above the Bitterroot River. And they have been doing flights in helicopters over the mine site, trying to do advocacy, talking about why a mine is not right in that place at this time. And so they are very much, they have the news hook to catch journalists. They're providing them a super cool experience of flying them over this landscape. I was talking through some of these ideas with her to help her figure out how to work with that audience. And she's got that news hook really, really solid. So the other thing that I also talked with her about is this number two, curating attendees, and that means both your journalists and your speakers. And so making sure you have the right people in the room that can stay on message when we're talking about your speakers. Um, Emily and I did an event, a journalist workshop on the Great Salt Lake and the Bear River that feeds the Great Salt Lake. And we knew we were a little out there with some of the politicals that we had as speakers for that event. A little worried that either they would take the subject off topic or the journalists would try to, get in on whatever the latest drama that was happening with the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. And but everyone was good. Everyone like stayed in their lane. And but you want to be really careful that, that message that you're trying to deliver is being presented in a way that you're comfortable with. When you're doing something like a workshop for the media, there's always a little bit of a risk in that uh, you can't control what they're going to report. And in that moment, when you have speakers in front of the room, you can't control what the speaker is going to say. You can coach, you can train, you can plead, but there's always a little bit of a risk with these events, which is different from a lot of the communications that we in conservation organizations do day in and day out. So you've got to make sure that your speakers, your journalists, your partners that are working with you on this, your staff have a little bit of a tolerance for that potential risk. So then, yeah, that kind of gets into the strategizing with the speakers to make sure that you have a key message that you want to deliver and that everyone is able to share that key message, but in different ways. And so I got all my speakers on the phone and I kind of had someone prep, someone who was a little bit of a senior leadership representative in that group of speakers who had a preference as to what he wanted, the key message that everyone could speak to on. And I was like, okay, I'd like to talk about kind of what's the one big thing that we want every journalist to know and hopefully go out and repeat after this event. And kind of that leadership representative who I had a little bit teed up and who was ready for it was like, I want to talk about solutions, positivity. I want to show people that we know what we're doing and we know how to combat this incredible conservation threat that we're looking at with invasive annual grasses and rangeland fire. And he's like, I don't want to air dirty laundry. I don't want to get into the things we're still trying to figure out. Like, let's just present what we know is working and really try to stick to that. And everyone was super good with that to speak to their different ways. And so a big topic that we covered was the herbicides that they're spraying across public and private lands to prevent germination of cheatgrass prior to the really lovely native perennial plants before they come up. And herbicides are a little controversial, but there are certain things that we know that are really working, and we've got lots of evidence to show that. And so, the BLM spoke to their kind of time utilizing that herbicide and what their experience has been. The university spoke about the science behind it. The rancher talked about how he's seen it work on his operation as well as other operations around him. So that was a really great way to kind of stay on message and really showcase like what we see as a key solution to this really significant threat. So then this next one, tactile learning. We in conservation do a lot of standing around in a field, waving our arms, talking about big concepts. And especially for journalists who aren't dealing with the kind of detailed technical work that we do in land and water and wildlife management, they don't know what we're talking about when we say, "Oh, that landscape out there, that looks bad because it's covered in cheatgrass and there's no shrubs or native grasses." You have to educate them, and by physically helping them understand what you're talking about, that really helps the learning process. And so, in the middle of our workshop a couple weeks ago, we were talking all about cheatgrass, about the different phases that cheatgrass can, how it looks different and how it has a little bit of forage value beforehand. And I realized none of the journalists really knew what we were talking about. So I bent down and I grabbed a handful of green cheatgrass and I grabbed a handful of purple cheatgrass, which is the same thing, just in different stages of its life cycle curing out. And I held it out to everyone, and everyone immediately like zoomed in and looked at it. And we passed it around, and people got to be like, ah, this is what we're talking about. These are the differences of the things. Another kind of tactile thing that one of the speakers did is he picked a volunteer out of the group and he's like, you come here. And he's like, grab that grass right there and pull it up. And she grabbed this handful of what was cheatgrass and she pulled it up and popped out it popped by its roots. And so it's got its little stubby roots, not a deep rooted perennial native. It's an invasive annual. And he's like, that's an example of how this plant is robbing all those resources at the soil top. And then he's like, now grab that one. And he pointed at another little grass and she grabbed it and she tugged and pop, it popped off, but the roots stayed in the ground. And he's like, that's blue bunch wheatgrass, or I don't even remember what the grass was, but that's a good native grass. And they've got deep roots and they can really hold that soil intact and they can best utilize the landscape. And so that was a really good way to be like, annual invasive, perennial native, to like visually and physically show people that sort of stuff. So there's a couple of other examples I'll show in the pictures of other kind of tactile learning experiences as we get there. And I guess my fifth hot tip is that there's no such thing as off the record. Even though I think Hollywood loves to show old school journalists talking about that, you can always say, I'd love to share this information with you on background, and I don't want to be quoted verbatim. You can always say that to a journalist. But everything these days is recordable, whether you want it to or not. And so on these events, I always say it is a completely on the record experience. And so when you're standing in line waiting for lunch with a journalist, or when you're riding around in the back of the car, don't be bad-mouthing your partner down the road or complaining about a funder, because all of this is on record, and we want this event to be super useful for journalists to learn and utilize and repeat. So we make these events fully on the record. So I just be very, very careful if you're going to say or do anything that is an off the record experience, just because there's very little actual legal backing behind that, and not always a lot of recourse for if you do say it's off the record and a journalist uses it, it's kind of the damage is already done. Okay, so those are my five hot tips. And I've just a couple slides about planning. I've got implementing and I've got following up. So planning, I had my colleague Mariah do a media analysis. So a pretty good online scrub of what's been published on the topic that you're doing a journalist workshop around. And just if it's being covered, if it's something that's already out there, kind of what's the angle that's unique to you and your organization that you can present to journalists. So doing a good media analysis of what's been done out there to understand what hasn't been and where you can tailor the speakers and the content that you're delivering. I always build an advisory group. I always say these are the people that help me not step in it. I had a member of an advisory group who had been in kind of the this was in Nevada, had been in the Nevada Collaborative Conservation Partnership world for a long time. And there was one or two people that suggested a speaker when I was with this advisory group that was helping us develop the agenda. And one or two people were like, yeah, that'd be a great speaker. Invite them. They can talk on X, Y, and Z. So I was like, okay, great. I will contact them. Well, I got a call as soon as we hung up from that group conversation being like, hey, that person, that one or two folks on that call was supportive of having be a speaker. They are going to throw your primary funder under the bus if you have them as one of the people to speak in front of these journalists. I would highly advise you not invite that person. And so that's a good way to just like, you don't live and breathe in every single one of these landscapes to know all the ins and outs of who has a relationship with who or how somebody performs when they get on the mic. I had another speaker who we were working on for this Wyoming one, and they were a very timid speaker. And they were already kind of identified as being someone to lead a whole section. And somebody else gave me a call, be like, hey, so and so, they're really uncomfortable in front of a group. If we could have them stand up with another person and kind of tag team a talk, that might be a great way for them to operate. And so that's kind of that advisory group. They're not always going to be all the speakers, they might be some of them, but they really help kind of advise and be that big picture expert on the topic that you're presenting and the people that are going to be in the room. And then this last one, build your Rolodex. So researching journalists, finding who's creating great content, finding who's creating content that you would really be worried about coming out of your publications. There are just some journalists that have certain stigmas or certain bents that I definitely don't invite to my events, even though they are in a relevant media outlet. So kind of building that Rolodex of journalists that have a little bit of knowledge about what you're covering, because it's really hard to bring someone from 0 to 100 to no knowledge about a topic to reporting about it accurately. So that Rolodex of journalists, be building that constantly so that when you do have an event, you have a great suite of people to reach out to get to attend. So implementing, I always do a little bit of coaching of the speakers. Um, Things like acronyms and technical jargon and vague references that a lot of conservation professionals might understand the background to. I have a I have this kind of quick sheet of tips for speakers when they're talking to journalists. So I have that hyperlinked here, and I'll have Nicole and Emily send out this presentation as well as that tip sheet. So it's just helping a speaker understand the level at which they need to talk to be able to deliver something to a journalist that they'll actually understand. So coaching the speakers, and then kind of then to do a little bit of coaching for the journalists, I want to try to provide them a good amount of background on what the speakers are going to be covering so that they can do a little research on their own, but then also think about the stories that they want to pitch to editors and to other publications. Half of my journalists that attended this last event were representing, not even half, I would say maybe just a third of my journalists were representing a publication. So then I knew that Mike was going to publish something in Wyophile, and I knew that Nikki was going to publish something in Wyoming Public Radio. But the majority of the other journalists were freelancers. And so they needed to come to this event, absorb the information, build the story in their head that they wanted to then pitch to editors after this event. So I don't know where half of these articles are going to come out. I know generally that certain journalists write for Field and Stream or Outdoor Life, or that others are more in the Grist or the Civil Eats beat. But I don't totally know for sure where theirs are coming out. So any background that you can provide ahead of time for them to start building that story concept is super, super helpful. And then this last one is one that I struggle with because I don't often think about other people's physical comforts when we're out in the field. And so that's why I have awesome team members making sure that there's bathrooms and food and first aid and that we don't do a 10-hour tour leaves everyone exhausted. And so be efficient with your field time because it's really hard to retain information after you've been, standing out in the baking hot sun in a burned landscape for the entire day. So making sure that you can take care of your people while you're out there so that your event is remembered for the content you wanted delivered, not for how uncomfortable they were when they were out there. Okay, so follow up. So this is the stage that I'm in for my event, and I have to kind of be doing this all the time. So make sure to send out your thank yous, that the journalists took time out of their really busy news cycle to come physically, like this, and I'm only really speaking to an in-person journalist workshop, that they came, they spent a couple days learning deeply about this type of stuff. So thanking your journalists and thanking your speakers, because they're kind of putting themselves out there, being vulnerable to talk to a group of journalists like this. So that's always so important. And then following up with full names, organizations, titles, and contact information so that the journalists can follow up with speakers to clarify something, fact check something they documented, ask a follow-up question. Not all of my speakers at this event were available to do so because they were feds on this. So I'm facilitating, I'm in a little bit kind of in the way of helping make sure I can facilitate that. But pretty much all other speakers were very glad to have follow-up conversations with journalists to make sure that they get the information accurately. And then it's always the experience of, even though I crafted this event and I was the primary contact for it, journalists publish something and never tell me. So I am constantly setting up Google alerts, subscribing to these publications, perusing their social media, the individual social medias of the journalists, to try to find if and when they publish something about it. So that's a lot of work that happens after an event like this. Emily, I actually didn't have the right Google alert set up, and Emily, right after my event, she's like, "You've got those are great stories," and I'm like, "What? What stories have come out?" So she was able to share those with me, and I was able to edit my Google alert, which still is not totally working, Emily. So I have to check in with you on that. But yeah, that's an important step. So then you see the results of what comes out, and can then share those with the speakers, that their voices were elevated through those outs. Okay. So here's a quickie on the hardest part, the easiest part, and then the best part. So there's a theme. It all has to do with people. So the hardest part was getting journalists to come out to this really rural place where they often had to drive 5 to 10 hours, or one even flew across the country to get there. We had multiple people who were flying into this area. So just getting that right group of journalists who's willing to give you the time of day to show up, that was hard. I invited probably over 100 journalists to this event that were this was all very much kind of in their wheelhouse of what they cover, and I got 14. And it was up until the week before that I was getting people to commit. The easiest part, I think, just in the world that we work in, is finding awesome, passionate speakers. Not a single person I asked to speak said no. And I had people who were contacting me saying, "Ooh, can I come and talk at your event?" And I had to kind of like curate again my speakers a little bit. So that was the easiest part. So hardest part, people. Easiest part, people. Best part, the people. So spending quality time in the field with these people who are the best in their craft. Whether it's this ranching family that's kind of in this picture, this is the Wilson family, 3 generations of them, talking about like what it was like to have that lightning storm go over, see that fire light up, this is Jim's granddaughter leave college so she could race home to help the family deal with this fire. Just like these people are the best of the best. That's always the neatest part, is meeting new faces, spending time with those that we know, and talking about what we love when it comes to this work. So yeah, those are my slides. I know I talked really fast. So does anyone have questions? And feel free, again, we'll share this with you, but you can also feel free to call me with your specific, like, I'm gonna do this event. What do you see that's good? What do you see that's like maybe a little dangerous? I'm totally game for that.
Hi, we just put on a media event like 2 weeks ago, and so I can see all the things I did wrong. As I go through that, I'm like, oh, that would have been a good thing. Um, um, but one of the issues we ran into, we were a little rural. It was probably like an hour from where a lot of the media people were coming from, and we had to do like we did an on-site presentation and then a tour of a field site. And I had media coming up, like calling me like an hour in, like wanting to show up, kind of like trickling in instead of sticking with the agenda. And so that was kind of hard. Luckily my speakers were a little more flexible, and were able to, kind of repeat some of their talks to some of, but for me, that was the challenging part was like having to keep your presenters happy and keeping them going and then catering to the media as well, who were
Mhm.
kind of also just doing their own thing.
Yeah. Part of what was useful about the landscape that we were in during the field tour is once we were out there, like you couldn't find us. So there were some people I can't think of like one person that I did allow to come a little bit later in the event, but it's because I knew their level of understanding and their abilities. They'd reported on this topic really extensively, so I was like okay with that. But there was another person who asked if they could only come for one day, and I said, really, this is all connected together, and we're going to limit participation to those that can be there for the event in full. And so I was kind of a bit of a meanie and didn't let them come. Which also, like, that publication could have been a really good get, but it was high country news. But I was like, no, I want you to hear everything rather than and then report something in partial format, or like you said, bother kind of be problematic for your speakers and thus kind of the whole group that was there. So I had to be a bad guy.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm
Go
curious
ahead.
from your perspective as the BLM, just kind of how it's in your role dealing with kind of especially with all the changes. I had to go through a lot of hoops with DOI to get my BLMer and my Wildland Fire Service guy and my NRCS guy approved. So I'm just curious, how's it working in your world right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of confusing still. We used to have someone that was directly in our office that was our public affairs person, and then they were reassigned. And so now we have to go through other layers, like up to our state office for things like that. So I haven't really experienced it fully without having that person here at our office. Like that change just happened in the last month or so. And I haven't had a need for like a press release or anything right now, but those kind of things had been taking a lot longer and wanting layers and layers of approval up to like the almost to the DOI level on some things, which maybe you experienced in so yeah, it's just kind of every day. It's sort of a what does today bring? So I'll be curious, like next spring when we have a lot of things that happen and we do a lot of public outreach, like what that might look like, and if they are going to try to, dissuade us and push those inquiries like up to the state office level rather than allow us to kind of talk to the media directly.
Yeah. Yeah, I had someone because I had to go through the whole DOI process, and then in the middle of it, I there was one process, and then Wildland Fire Service was then officially separated, and then there was another process for them. So we were able to do it, and that was amazing because that's what the journalists were like, "Ooh, we can actually ask questions and quote, a BLMer, the BLM range specialist, or the fuels manager in the fire division." So I think that was like an intriguing thing that they could actually get those people quoted. So that was awesome that we were still able to do it. But then someone had some follow-up questions afterwards, and they just got the final answers, but it took 3 weeks of submitting the questions to DOI. DOI essentially chatting with that employee, developing written responses that then they sent back to the journalist, and then the journalist is going to quote. And so it's a very slow, and it's just hard with the speed of news for that to actually be useful. But for the reporters who can take that time, they can still get that type of content from the field folks, which is pretty good.
Hannah, can you talk a little bit about size of the events and like what your thoughts are on capping the number of participants, like what the ideal group size is for both participants, for both the journalists and for your speaker group, like thinking about like how to not overload people with sources and information.
Yeah. So I feel like this was a good balance of a group, and it was pretty much a one-to-one speaker to journalist ratio. And so 14 speakers, 13 or 14 14 journalists, 13 or 14 speakers, I think is what we ended up with. And then we had a few like bonus people that showed up, which I always tried to prevent, but it worked out fine. Bonus people that ended up saying some things that, I didn't have their titles or anything documented, but they were with the local weed and pest district, so they had the flexibility and the ability to do that. Um, they ran that picture of the giant drone that sprays herbicide, which was super cool, and everyone was like, all excited about that tech. So I have always capped these events at no more than 15 journalists because they're all a little competitive. Sometimes, like, we did have really diverse publications between public radio, and there's a magazine called the DC Equalizer and Project Upland magazine and Field and Stream. Like, they don't, those groups don't exactly compete, but they all want the scoop. They all want, information that they are the only ones presenting, and they have those quotes. And so any more than 15, I'm worried about competition between organizations. And like I did have YO File, Wyoming Public Radio, and like a couple of the smaller local newspapers, which do overlap in their audiences quite a bit. And so I know they didn't love that, but hey, it's what happened. So I can only like prevent it so far. And when it comes to the time that it takes to plan these field experiences, I want to try to get close to 15 journalists to make it worth my time and my partner's time to have done this. But something that I've always said we should do, and we've never well, we're kind of doing it one-off, Emily. Mostly when journalists come to us and want to talk to one of our staff about a specific topic, trying to do like a small group, like 3 journalists, or like a one-on-one experience with a journalist where it's not a whole field tour with 14 speakers and it's just like a one-on-one. That I think is efficient as far as time, and is also really what journalists love. But again, you got to have that hook. Like, what is it that they're covering or that they're interested in that you can present that's timely and newsworthy and things like that. So I'm always open to, because like Emily, I'll be curious like what we actually get out of those 14 journalists that attend, how many actually produce something, because I know not all of them will. And so even though I was shooting for that, what's the return on investment of all of our time? That is always the question for communications. Does it work?
Hannah, so for like this 2-day event, was there any perks or benefits or things that you provided to the journalists to kind of encourage them to come, whether that's like lodging and food, transportation, like any of that? Or is it mostly you provide the opportunity and they come on their own dime?
That's a really good point that I should incorporate into that presentation in case I give it to anyone else. We provided travel scholarships. And so that was huge. There were a couple journalists that didn't accept it. I was shocked at just like over time. First journalist workshop, only 1 or 2 organizations and journalists accepted the journalist workshop, and it helped pay for lodging, mileage, airfare, and meals, not including alcohol. And so and it was like 300 or $400 that first one. And then we've gone up like a couple $100s, which each of these event, almost every journalist in this event accepted the journalist workshop. Like public radio accepted the journalist workshop. Like certain publications that I thought would never do something like that did. So that just kind of shows the state of newsroom budgets right now and how critical having that type of funding was to making sure these events can happen. And we didn't, nothing about this was bougie. Like we had white bread sandwiches in the field and water. And so there are, like when I was a journalist living in Latin America, there were some bougie trips that the publication that I worked for sent me on. But that is just, that's not the experience that we're presenting, and especially because we're using a lot of federal money to do these type of events. We don't want it to be fancy. We want it to be real, and we want the type of journalists that want that experience as well.
And that's one thing, Nicole, like we talk about this a lot with our journalist workshops. Like we don't want it to be a press junket where we are like paying people essentially to say a certain thing. Like that's not the type of journalism that we want to come out of this. So like we do like those travel scholarships are to help people like show up and be there because that's a barrier to a lot of journalists these days. But like as much as possible, like we try to incentivize people by like the speakers that we invite and the topic that we're covering and kind of like that insider access. I know like a lot of the landowners that we have speak at these events are people that journalists would not be able to connect with otherwise. And so thinking about like how you can get people to want to come to these for the sources that they're going to have access to more so than anything else is something we talk a lot about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the maximum travel scholarship we allocated was $800, and they drove 9 hours to get to this event and back. So 9 hours there, 9 hours back. If you're just looking at the GSA mileage rate, that's $763 or something like that. So just them driving there alone ate up their travel scholarship. And so it's and the lodging in Thermopolis is not schwank, neither is the food. So it was still a lovely experience because that's what you get in small town America.
Well, I was just kind of curious what was the funding source that you had? You said it was a federal, but just curious like what pot it was from or
hmm hmm Yeah, Wildlife Division of the BLM. So
oh, okay.
we have an interagency agreement with the BLM to help facilitate communications with and for them. So that's where it came
Okay.
from. hmm
Awesome.
We probably had a
Because
little
that
Fish and Wildlife Service in there. But yeah, kind of the agencies that fund us are who paid
mhm.
for it.
Okay, yeah, because like as a BLM, like we can't I mean, we usually rely on partners to do like an honorarium if we're getting a speaker or to cover some of those lodging costs because it's like a paperwork nightmare for one, and
Yep.
it's not really worth it for what you get. So,
Yeah,
okay, thanks.
exactly.
Just
That's why you run
curious.
it through us.
Yes.
Mhm. Mhm. Cool. Well, thanks everyone. I'll make sure that these get shared with you and feel free to reach out to me with any questions or if you want to see my strategy documents that I design, anything is available for sharing.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for joining today and sharing this.